Essentially, I wanted to take this time just to talk a little bit about my um, cancer journey and sort of provide a context in terms of being both an Indigenous family, but also a family that's located within the New Zealand public health system, and how that experience that we had personally, that I had personally, impacted me and my family. So Whanau is the name for family, with a genomics test that we did. And so just really quickly, this is basically my traditional lands. We sit in the Hauraki Gulf, which isn't quite Auckland, thank you very much, Auckland, but we sit just outside of Auckland in a place called the Firth of Thames. We own the only remaining traditional lands on that western coast of the Firth of Thames, but this is basically where I'm from, and my family have lived here since 1300 AD. So just a little while over 700 years, something like that. And this is a shot taken recently of my family, my whānau. I'm in the photo. So within this photo is probably a third of my family. My family numbers about 300. This is about a third of us. We're gathered here for a wedding on this particular day. But in this photo, there are 5 of us who are active cancer patients, basically. This is a shot of my colleagues at work. Again, just kind of grounding me to where I come from and connecting me to my whānau. This is a photo of my grandfather, and just a very kind of quick overview of my family. We have a high incidence of cancers in all of our generations, in particular those cancers there. So this is my grandfather, my mum's dad, and from her generation, out of 12 siblings, 6 passed away with cancer. We have diagnoses now amongst children, young children. The youngest, I think, was 4 years old, teenagers, young adults, midlifers like myself, and of course our elder generation. 300 members of us scattered around the world. This is the timeline of my experience with cancer. So I was involved in the 80s and the 90s with the GE debate in New Zealand. Indigenous peoples were kind of sidelined and on the periphery of that debate, which brought up a lot of mistrust between Māori, between our Indigenous peoples, and public health and science. 2011, my son's cancer was diagnosed. He was 19 years old. Then in 2015 and 2016, I had breast cancer myself. 2020, New Zealand first went into level 4 lockdown. My mum had just had her diagnosis of breast cancer at 83. And she carried out her treatment during level 3, I think it was, a couple of months later, which essentially set us all, particularly myself, along a genomics pathway, accessing genomics as an answer or solution for our whānau with high incidences of cancer. So in my first genetics counselling meeting, when I met somebody in the public health system, this was basically the motivation for me to follow a genomics pathway. I didn't realise that the public health system could gather your information, and that information of your children, that information of your aunties, your cousins, your nieces, your mum's generation, right up to your grandmother and grandfather's generation, in a genealogy tree like this. And for me to see this on a screen when I went to my first genetics counselling session was life-changing, to be honest. I didn't know that samples of blood from my son, when he went through his treatment, was still held on a record. Obviously it's a private record, but still held in the public health records, and available for them to compile all of this information for me to go into a counselling session. So essentially, what I think our whānau or our family grappled with is patients, as you know, a group of 300 Indigenous peoples. What we grapple with are these challenges that I've listed here, and the one that I talked about with samples and who has possession of those samples or that data beyond the life of a person, or beyond those people who have passed. What are those issues around privacy versus disclosure? As a family, we went to proactively get a group health insurance, and our disclosure then became a little bit problematic, because we had to disclose that, you know, we've had so many people who have had cancer, been diagnosed with cancers, and all of those issues of mistrust that I talked about with health services and specialists come up for each and every one of us as we go through our diagnosis and our treatment. So when we're trying to address the gap, you know, of health literacy, of where we were at with our cancer pathways, trying to get more positive solutions, basically genomics became more of a option for our whānau, but certainly not without challenges. So what we did was we talked, we had to have discussions, and we certainly had to talk intergenerationally, because our cancers are intergenerational. So here's one of those talks that we're having, and obviously there the one with the laptop is my cousin. She's still with us, and she was diagnosed just before me, I think, with breast cancer. We're about the same age, and those are some of my nieces, my nephews, and my cousins. So essentially on the journey of that discussion, our whānau try to incorporate and consider our customary beliefs and values in something in genetics, you know, genetics technology, genomics technologies. To try and incorporate customary values and beliefs is quite difficult. However, with the help of scientists, specialists, clinicians, research teams, having that kind of cross communication conversation, it becomes easier. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it becomes easier to talk about things like 1, 2, 3, 4, number 5 down that list. The consideration that DNA material, DNA samples, the data from DNA is considered tapu or sacred. It's considered not for the public domain. It's considered so sacred that you have to pray over that particular sample, that particular data, before that ease comes about, to then be able to talk about the data, to talk about the DNA in a way that honours and acknowledges all of those who have gone past. And certainly for me, it gives me a more of a freedom and an ease to talk about my son. And I know that, you know, for our whānau, we know that is a place that we want to go with our cancer journey, but we can't do it without considering our customary beliefs and our values. Essentially, also we're socialising this particular science, these particular solutions with all of our family. So we're trying to build that health literacy around cancer genomics, cancer genomic technologies. So this is one of the initiatives that my cousin and I undertook, and it was basically to call all of the women in our whānau together, to laugh, to have a barbecue, to cook, to have some wine, talk right across our generations about cancers, about genomics, and about genomics as a serious pathway and solution for our family. Just a really quick diagram of how process-wise we'd like to look for our solutions for our family. So essentially engaging with specialists to increase our literacy, certainly participating in genetics counselling, and dealing with all of those issues that I talked about. And then, of course, the last part is looking towards where we can develop our own protocols, our own processes based on our customary beliefs and values so that we can move forward. And that last part is really, really critical in terms of consenting to benefit our whānau, as opposed to consenting and then person passes away and we know nothing about where that data has gone to, how it's used, how it's further applied. And lastly, this is basically why we're doing it, because we want our intergenerational legacy not to be one of fear, because we don't know who's going to get cancer next, but certainly one of with positive solutions, with positive outcomes, and of course a contribution towards the knowledge within New Zealand, within Aotearoa, of how cancer genomic technologies can help whānau. Thank you.
Kia ora, Irene, whakaaro kaha. Very powerful ideas, and what a wonderful way to ground the meeting. And thank you so much for sharing your story. Kia ora.
Kia ora.